My friends, today I'm going to be talking to you about the only compressors that seem to matter anymore when you get into a studio, and we'll be going through some examples of each of them. In the world of software emulation, there are tons of different new compressors that we're seeing all the time, but when you step into a studio, they seem to have a select few of tracking compressors that are used over and over again. And I think it's important to understand what you're going to be getting yourself into, and also being able to understand some of the alternate options that you could use in the software format, as well as some of the clones. So we're going to be talking about all that today. By the end of this video, you're going to have a great grasp on the type of compressors that you want to use when you're inside the studio, and something that you could grab in case you don't have that available. So let's get into it. Number one, the TubeTech CL1B. This was originally released in 1991, and the reason I'm bringing this one up is because it's a newer iteration. It's something that is basically in every mainstay studio now, whether it's the original TubeTech CL1B, the Warm Audio CL1B, or the Heritage successor. Some variation of this is going to be in a studio. One thing I want to mention about this video is I'm specifically talking about channel compressors in this video. I'm not talking about bus compressors. So that's something that we'll save for a later time. It's probably the most transparent compressor that we're using these days, and what it does is add on some of the features that aren't from the predecessor to this, the LA-2A, which we're going to be getting into in a bit. I didn't start with that because we kind of already all know what that is, right? The CL1B is mainly used for vocals, bass, and acoustic guitar. I don't see people using this on drums too often, but it's something that you could use if you wanted to. If you look behind me, I actually have the clone of this, the Warm Audio CL1B, which I think sounds great. I swapped out the tubes in it, and I'm not typically somebody that gets way too into this, like, oh, you need this specific type of tube. I think the characteristics that come from a tube swap are important, but I think that's almost less important than matching it with whatever else is going on in the unit. I don't think that there's just a type of tube that sounds better than other types of tubes. So what makes the CL1B so special? Originally, when we had opto compressors, they would run off of an opto cell. And you can actually learn a lot about this in my video that I did with Audioscape not a long time ago, talking about the breakup and makeup of an LA-2A. But in the CL1B, it doesn't show that there's really space for an opto cell. I've opened this one, I've opened the original one, and there is no real spot for that, which leads me to believe that it's using a Vactrol. And by using a Vactrol gives the ability for you to have attack and release, because an opto cell wouldn't allow for that. I know it's a little bit nerdy, but I figured I would explain at least what is so special about this one compressor. Used on everything from Bruno Mars to Adele and Beyonce's Lemonade, and the list goes on. This is one of the mainstays compressors that is not going to be going anywhere anytime soon. So let's take an example and listen to the CL1B, the Warm Audio 1B, and a plugin that you could use in case you didn't have either of those options available. Now, when Howard Benson Vocals was originally thought of, it didn't have the CL1B compressor in it. Now, the rest of the module follows super closely to what Howard does, and Howard does like a more additional compression later on after it's out of the box, right? But when he's tracking, he actually uses a CL1B himself and a Neve 1073. And now there is that CL1B option inside of Howard Benson Vocals. So that's one way you could get that kind of sound and not have to spend thousands of dollars, because we know the CL1B is around $4,000. And when you can't get it, it goes to $5,000 or $6,000. These are a little over $1,000. They sound awesome. It's a great compressor. And Howard Benson Vocals is a fraction of the price of either of those things. So depending on what your budget is and what your intended use is, there's some options for you. I like using the one in Howard Benson Vocals lately just because it takes out my analysis paralysis and I don't have to mess with the attack and release time so much because it does that automatically. On to our next compressor, the LA-2A. This was made in 1965 and is pretty famous for albums like Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, Fleetwood Mac, Rumors. All this information that's in my mind, by the way, I think about it and I'm like, this is probably why I can't remember how to drive 3 streets over, you know what I'm saying? The LA-2A is the original opto compressor, and it works off of an opto cell. Like I was saying, check out the other video if you really want to get in depth with that. The reason why people like using an LA-2A is actually the fact that it doesn't have a ton of functionality. It's really simple. You're just sitting there adjusting. And speaking of that, yeah, I have the Audioscape LA-2A back here, but you're mainly just adjusting the peak reduction in the gain on the unit. And then deciding whether you want it to be in limited and compressed mode. So you're taking away things like attack, release, and the ratios, and possibly knee, and all that stuff that comes with other compressors. Let's take a listen to the LA-2A. A few options for this besides the Teletronix LA-2A, like I said, is the Audioscape LA-2A back there that we're going to be checking out, and also a module inside of Bus Glue from Joey Sturgis Tones. So we're gonna check that out as well.
You either wish me well or give me hell. I talk about last night, but I don't kiss and tell. Live to tell, I didn't run to love, I walked in and fell. And now my life's a living hell. You either wish me well or give me hell. I talk about last night, but I don't kiss and tell. Live to tell, I didn't run to love, I walked in and fell. And now my life's a living hell. You either wish me well or give me hell. I talk about last night, but I don't kiss and tell. Live to tell, I didn't run to love, I walked in and fell. And now my life's a living hell. You either wish me well or give me hell. I talk about last night, but I don't kiss and tell. Live to tell, I didn't run to love, I walked in and fell. And now my life's a living hell.
Now, this next compressor that we're going to be talking about is pretty popular, and it's also sitting right behind me. That would be the Distressor. If you're not familiar with that one and it doesn't ring a bell, well, hopefully you do. Make sure you hit that notification bell, that like button, and that subscribe button to help us keep growing on this channel. We're almost at 100,000 now, and that's all thanks to you guys and what we've worked on together throughout the year. So thank you for that and help us get there. Before I get too deep into the Distressor, I kind of want to talk about the time period of when the previous compressors were made, because the LA-2A was made in 1965, and then the TubeTech CL1B was made in 1991. So, you know, 25, 30 years, like that area of a gap. And then you have the Distressor, which was made in 1995. And what this has that's really popular with people is like its FET emulation for the 1176, which was made in 1965. Or no, 1967, there we go. What I'm basically saying is it seems like within that 30-year time frame that we wanted to move on to something new. Now, the Distressor doesn't just have FET mode, but it also gives you the option for opto mode. And for VCA, you can do all that right from this little guy, and there's distortion modes that are in it as well. It has 9 discrete signal paths, and it's marked at around $1,400. This thing will give you the options of doing almost anything. And that's why in mainstay studios, it's so popular to have a Distressor. Now, it's a bit more aggressive, I would say, than an LA-2A or a CL1B, but it is a Swiss Army knife when it comes to compression. You can get a very transparent compression in opto mode. You can get a more aggressive compression, especially when you start using the distortion modes. And I think you can get really close to a Blue Stripe 1176 by messing around with the distortion modes as well, because it's kind of like that upper mid grit. So let's take a listen to the Distressor and let's see where we could compare that to something else. Now, like I said, the Distressor is one of my favorite compressors, and through the different modes, you can hear lots of different styles of compression. And you can kind of slam that thing, and I don't think there's anything that sounds exactly like it, but out of the emulation style things that I have heard of it, I do think that the Arouser is the best one, the one by Empirical Labs, and they're the ones that make the Distressor themselves. So I would go and check that out as far as having something in the box that could relate to that. There's nothing in the studio that's going to relate to having a Distressor except having basically every type of compressor. So if you have an 1176 blue stripe and a blackface and an LA-2A or whatever, then I guess you don't need to have this, but I still feel like it has its own thing. And I think the Distressor pins a vocal to the center and stays there smack more than any other compressor. Personal thoughts. Onto the last compressor we all know, the 1176. When you go into a mainstay studio, one thing I forgot about the Distressor, Distressor was really popular being used on Radiohead, OK Computer, and Foo Fighter Wasting Light. Those were some breakout albums that made the Distressor kind of a mainstay, and I don't think people talk about that enough. Now the 1176. We'll just go off into what albums the 1176 were used on that was really popular. Foo Fighters, Nevermind, Michael Jackson's Thriller, and the blackface and the blue stripe are different styles of compression. The blackface is a little bit more mild and the blue stripe has some upper mid-range grit, but they're both FET compressors, so they're going to have more harmonic distortion than their counterparts. I'm pretty sure at this point we all know what an 1176 is, but I figured let's go through it really quickly and listen to an 1176. What I think I like using an 1176 for is getting really aggressive, and the closest thing that comes to an 1176 in my mind is kind of gain reduction from JST for what I like. But there are more mild things, mild compressors. Like I really like the Universal Audio 1176. I think that sounds really good. But for that, like all buttons in, like smashing a vocal, that and gain reduction kind of do that for me. I know gain reduction's kind of like balls to the walls with it, but that's probably my favorite out of the bunch. So let's take a listen to that.
She's a grapevine whore for sure, more like a prisoner. If not for her, I would believe the Lord. She's a grapevine whore for sure, more like a prisoner. If not for her, I would believe the Lord. She's a grapevine whore for sure, more like a prisoner. If not for her, I would believe the Lord.
And I guess one other one that you would throw in here this isn't seen in major studios all the time now because there's so many different desks and different things to use. But yes, the SSL channel compressor. This is the one that you see that's based off of the console. And if people don't have an SSL console in their room, most of the time they don't tend to have these. They'll use something else. I've noticed that. Even though they have like the SSL racks and all different types of iterations, I have some myself. They're right over here. The SSL compressor has been used on millions of albums at this point just because it was the compressor that was inside of the desk. And I think that it's closely related to, well, no, I know that it's closely related to a DBX 160. And that's why a lot of people will use DBX 160s still to this day. This isn't in my major list, by the way, though, because not a lot of studios are using that as a go-to compressor. It's something that's more like sitting there just because they've had it for the last like 20, 30 years. But the SSL compressor is in the more transparent range. It's very gluey compared to all the other compressors that we're talking about, more gluey than a CO1B or an LA-2A in my opinion. It pins the closest to something like a Distressor in my mind, and it's not anything like an 1176 at all. Those are two completely different beasts because you have a VCA versus a FET compressor. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I wanted to just go through and kind of pin a bunch of options so that you knew what the main stuff that we're seeing in studios right now still is. And some alternative options if you just don't have the budget to spend the thousands of dollars that it costs for each one of them. If you're an engineer on the come up, give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. You only have to do it one time. And tap that bell for notifications so when a video drops, you know the location. Till next time, my friends. I'll catch you later.